So, hi Josh. In your case, it was easy to find out what your first language was. It seems like was early Java.
Yes, it was. I was actually using it before the 1.0 release.
Because of Ian Smith.
Yeah. Ian was he was a grad student at Georgia Tech when I was an undergrad, and I just finished like some C and a few other traditional languages, and I was going to dive into my first object-oriented language. And I said, "What do you think? Should I look at Smalltalk or Objective C?" Or I mean, Smalltalk or C++. And he says, no, that's old news. You should try this new Java thing we've been working on. And he was doing his internships at Sun, so he had access to early betas. So I think he taught the first Java class in a university, which I took.
Oh,
And that was 95, I want to say, like spring of 95. Wow, that was a long time ago. Yeah, that was over 20 years ago.
so the
Crazy.
great. So, what you did with Java then?
So back then, I mean, I was still learning to be a good programmer, but it was a really easy way of doing OO design without a lot of the pitfalls that are in C++. So I think the first real project I built, I was also taking graphics at the time, and so I built a ray tracer in Java, which was not considered wise at the time because Java was so much slower than native code then.
Oh,
But
that's
it worked. Like the code just compiled and worked. It was very clean compared to equivalent C. It was
with
nice.
JDK 1.0.
Yeah, it might have been 1.1. No, I'm trying to think. No, I don't think Swing was out yet. I think it was 1.0.
But Java 2D was out, or what do you use then?
That was just straight image buffer stuff. It would
Oh,
because each pixel was separate. Yeah, so that was AWT.
so you are a hardcore programmer, right? This is crazy.
um, I would consider myself a good programmer, but I'm not a great programmer. I know this because I worked with some really great programmers at Sun, like people who did operating system stuff or they wrote compilers. There was amazing talent at Sun. I
Okay, so
learned a lot.
why they were great? So you say they were great programmers. So what's the deal? Who is a great
Sun
programmer?
Sun had managed to collect just really talented engineers over the years, back from their workstation days. And when Java came out, and James Gosling and his crew built it, and they started marketing it, a lot of the engineers wanted to switch to Java because they'd been writing C and C++, and just in terms of developer productivity was a lot better.
Oh, that's
But
interesting.
yeah, yeah, I mean, there were some people who were against it because they didn't like the idea of virtual machines, and
Hmm.
they're like, it's always going to be slower, and I mean, it's still, I suppose, at least until the end of my time at Sun, there was still that trade-off of speed versus safety. And I think in the end, Java won because it got faster, but C++ didn't get very much
Yeah,
safer. So I think C++ is being used less for new projects than it used to be.
yeah. At the end, people told me that Java is just a system language. It's way too fast. So it's just okay, to go with Groovy and Scala, even if it's slower. It doesn't matter. This was actually interesting. Yeah. And was it Applet what you built, or you spent more time on bare metal? Was it inside a JFrame, I guess? No frame, AVT frame, I think, no JFrame. This was before Swing, right? Your ray
Right.
tracer.
Initially, it was AWT, but essentially, I was just writing to an array of memory, and
Okay.
then I would turn that into an image every second, and then draw it to the screen.
Okay.
Because ray tracing a pixel, I mean, I was running this on like a 66 megahertz 46, something
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
Ray tracing even a single pixel with just a couple spheres took way longer than redrawing to the screen.
Okay.
But it
So,
was fun.
okay. So, what was your second project then? So, I'm really curious now.
I'm trying to remember. let's see. The second, I mean, I'm sure I wrote lots of things, and JSPs were just starting. No, not JSPs. Servlets were just starting to be. I do remember building a web server. Well, it wasn't really a web server. It was using the servlet engine like Tomcat, but all of the HTML was generated on the fly from Java code, which was a bad idea. You should never put your markup in your source code, but I'm sure I did that a few times. Probably the coolest other thing I did in college, beyond the UI toolkit stuff, was I'd read Snow Crash. I'd read several cyberpunk novels, but then I read Snow Crash in
Metaverse,
college.
right?
Yeah, with the metaverse. And it had this really unique idea of there were people who had the high-end headsets and had this very detailed world view. Super high resolution, super low latency. But then people would come in, like they dial in from, I guess, the equivalent of a payphone. Mm-hmm. Which is funny that we have sci-fi that didn't have the idea of cell phones. But yeah, people came in through a payphone, and their avatars were lower resolution, or maybe it was just a video capture. But the metaverse worked with it. It had this idea of scalability between different experiences. So I built a very early prototype of, there's a virtual world with a 3D view and a 2D view. And I'm sure, again, this was right after I'd taken graphics. So I built, this was probably swing level graphics. I built a 3D interface and a 2D overhead interface. And it sounds far more elaborate than it was. I mean, it was literally like 5 polygons. You were like this little penguin guy going through a grid plane, or an overhead of a penguin's arrow head walking around a 2D view. But you could have 2 windows open, and they could interact with each other. They could walk around and stuff. And I haven't thought about that in ages, but I realized that we've just built that with Moziila with Hubs, where we have this idea of a virtual space that works in 2D or 3D. It works on desktop or phone or in a full VR headset. And that the experience scales to whatever device you have available at the time.
There was a project at Sun, and I forgot actually the name. There were 2 projects. One was like a 3D Spaces project, and the other one was, I actually built some extensions for that. And the other one was built upon the first. And the idea was like 3D space world for commercial use and for education. Remember that?
Was that Project Wonderland? No, Project Looking Glass, maybe. Or maybe
Wonderland.
both.
You're right. This was a Wonderland. It was like the 3D space experience where you can walk around and touch stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Looking Glass might have been like a 3D window manager.
Exactly.
And then they sort of stuck them together, because I think you could bring like OpenOffice or a web browser into the 3D shared space.
This was the Wonderland project, exactly. This was like the shared space. And on that note, there was a Second Life. You remember that?
Mm-hmm. I do remember Second Life at the time. There's actually a bunch of Second Life users on my team now.
Yeah, this is what I guess. But the interesting story of Second Life was the scalability. So, like, the different worlds or the islands, they were actually servers. So if you move from one world to another, it took some time, and this was the time to transfer your context between servers. So I thought this was a really interesting idea, how to map scalability to user experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that a lot of those ideas are coming back again. It's funny. People have been trying to create VR at least since the late 60s, and every 10 years it seems to come out and then it dies just because the technology wasn't ready. And I feel like this time it's really working. Smartphones have made all the components cheap enough that we can build VR devices that are portable, lightweight, long enough battery, powerful enough graphics, just by riding the smartphone wave. And the internet's good enough now that we can have all these social experiences. So I think it's real this time.
Yeah, I think so. So your second project was the 3D and 2D or whatever. What interests me, what was actually the experience at Sun? So in one point of time you worked for Sun, right?
Yeah, I spent 5 years there. Sun was sort of my dream job. I'd been so after I graduated in '97, and immediately went out to Silicon Valley and was just immersed in startup culture. And I worked at a couple startups, and then the dot-com bust happened, and I had worthless stock. So I moved back to Atlanta, and I did what everybody in Atlanta did, which was you work for either like Coke or Turner. I ended up working for Home Depot because their world headquarters was there, and working for Verizon. Just big enterprise internal stuff. And I was so bored, I started writing these blogs, just doing fun things with graphics and Swing. And that eventually led to a book with O'Reilly, and that led to getting an offer to join the Swing team at Sun back in California. So I jumped at the chance, and I think I was on the Swing team for about 2 years. The first year, I was just working on the Windows look and feel, like getting all those little details right and really learning how Swing worked internally, much more than I did when I was writing the book. And Swing was a really incredible, like the architecture was really elegant. It certainly had limitations, but the fact that people are still able to write new productive applications after 20 years, that's a long time for a UI toolkit to be useful.
Yeah, and
Swing was really well designed.
And IntelliJ and WebStorms are still based on Swing, right?
I believe so, yeah. And I use WebStorm every day.
Yeah.
That's my go-to editor.
Yeah.
Swing was a really good team, and the people on the Swing team were just really nice. I learned a lot from them. They're great guys.
Mm-hmm. There was Amy Fowler, I think, and
Jeff Dickins. Who else was on that team? Yeah, quite a few. And then when I moved to Oregon, because I got married, I switched teams to the NetBeans team to work on the GUI builder. So it's still Swing related, but it was tools for Swing rather than the toolkit itself.
But you also work on the Windows look and feel, right?
Yeah, my first year was the Windows look and feel.
So what interests me from the technological perspective is you try to do everything pixel perfect. So what interests me, in one point of time, the Swing started to use native controls, right?
It didn't exactly use native controls. What happened was with the switch from when XP, so Windows XP, for you youngins, Windows XP was like the longest used version of Windows. It's still being used some places, but it was the major version of Windows for at least 10 years. And somewhere along like XP2, I think, like the Service Pack 2, they introduced an official theming API. Before then, people had written like hacks that could change the look of all the widgets, and it didn't work terribly well. And so they introduced this theming API, and you could have official themes. And the API was documented, and you could actually get access to all of the bitmaps. So what we did was we were still using Swing controls, but it was a look and feel that would actually talk to the operating system and get all those bitmaps, and do our best to draw the Swing controls exactly the same textures, the same fonts, the exact same metrics, the borders and the what's the word? Padding, the padding around all the buttons. So we did our best to make it look absolutely native. Whether that was the right thing to do, I don't know, because eventually the world moved to the web, and it turns out people didn't care that stuff looked native anymore. But at the time, we were very proud of the work that we did.
No, it was really important. In all projects, there was also Swing has to look native and so forth. So it was a big deal back then.
Yeah. The hardest thing was actually not the text controls or the buttons. It was the progress bar. Because the progress bar had this subtle little animation in it that was very difficult to replicate.
Okay. And then you worked for NetBeans. You worked on the Matisse GUI builder?
Yeah, I worked on the fixing bugs in the GUI builder, adding the menu builder to that, and we were starting to work on an app framework. So I added the app framework support where you could do things like you could switch which language you were writing in, I don't mean programming language, but actual human language. So you could see like, show me my whole GUI in English and now switch it to German, and I can see, oh, these are the ones I'm missing, and I can type those in. And there was an action framework, so you could register through your whole app. You could have, these are the 40 actions with their icons and the code they call, and then wire it up to your GUI.
It was
Yeah,
the
it's
Swing
cool.
JSR 296 or something, like it was like the Swing application
Something like
framework.
that, yeah. You might remember better than I do.
Yeah, this was Swing application framework and data binding frame. There were like 2 APIs, and one was
Yeah,
done.
I don't know if those ever were finalized. It seemed like they were in draft for a long time.
Yeah, then were stopped by the on hold. Also the one was latest 296, I think it was. And yeah, this was actually an interesting story. This was a great API. I actually don't remember the reasons why they were stopped.
I don't remember the official reasons, but the unofficial was just smartphones were starting to take off. The world was changing. A lot of the engineers moved to work on Android at Google or work on web technology, and then Swing itself was kind of paused, and we started working on JavaFX as a way to compete with Flash. So it just became like everybody moved on to other stuff, and so there wasn't really anyone left to work on core Swing things anymore.
It was indeed JSR 296, and the name is Swing Application Framework, and it was withdrawn in 2011.
Yeah, which was after I left, but it was basically dead before then.
Okay. And you liked to work at Sun still? You enjoyed the 5 years, or?
My 5 years was really fun. I met some great people. Almost everybody I worked with went on to do wonderful things at other companies. JavaFX was super fun. I got to go to South by Southwest. I helped with the launch of JavaFX, where a bunch of us got together and we built out this website in a month that had like 16 or 20 demos showing all the APIs.
Also the Tesla demo, you remember this?
Oh yeah, the Tesla demo.
There was the very first Tesla demo. It was like the Lotus, Lotus Elise car, and this was like a car configurator for Tesla based on JavaFX.
Yeah. Boy, that was a long time ago.
And how you remember how JavaFX actually started? There was like form follows function F3 project first.
Yeah,
right?
that was Chris Oliver had built this sort of language on top of a scene graph library, and at the time we were looking at overhauling how graphics were done internally, both for Swing and for other stuff. As I said, this was a time of transition in the industry where smartphones were taking off and GPUs were starting to become affordable. We could anticipate that one day every computer will have a GPU. And so we were looking at, well, how do we overhaul the graphics stack to use shaders, to use textures? How do we either build new stuff for the new world or bring the old stuff up? So yeah, it was a time of big transition and change. The way people bought software was changing. My last year at Sun, I worked on the Java Store, which was a desktop store for desktop Java applications. And
before Apple Store.
Yeah, this was before the Mac Store. And we, I think in about a year, our little small team of people, including like James Gosling had this idea, and he got a bunch of us together and we built it. And we were able to do our first sale in less than a year, which by Sun standards, going from product to revenue in a year, it was light speed. So we did do our first sale, and then I think a month later, Oracle bought us and decided they didn't want to be in that market, so they canceled the desktop store project. Mm-hmm. But it was fun. It was fun.
And then you left Sun.
Then I left Sun, yeah. The last day, I was kind of tired of desktop at the time, and mobile was really taking off. So I'd been interviewing, and my last day at Sun was the last day that before Oracle took over.
Oh.
And then I joined. It was the very last day. And I've been kind of moving away from it, pure engineering, more into developer advocacy, developer evangelism. So I joined Palm at that time to work on WebOS. And at the time, I had very little JavaScript experience, but I knew UI very well, and I'd gotten into mobile. So that was the beginning of me learning more JavaScript and also helping. It turned out there was actually a fair amount of Java in WebOS. Most of the services were built in Java, and a lot of the tools.
So that you had was Java running on the device?
It was. It was basically J2ME, but no, it was closer to Java SE, but with the specs of J2ME. It was a very strange version of Java. I'm not sure where they got it from, but all of the basic services like email and syncing your calendars and your contacts, that was all in Java. Slowly, they when Node.js took off, they started moving more of that into JavaScript because Node let them do high-performance JavaScript, or at least the CPU-bound processes, they still kept in Java. But anything that was I/O-bound, they moved to Node.js because it was really good for I/O-bound computation.
But WebOS was actually great operating system, I think, and the hardware is also nice. So what's always asked me, why HP canceled that? You know that?
I've thought about this many times because it was a blow to all of us. I think so. HP bought us at the time. HP bought us, and I'd only been there maybe 6 months when HP took over. They had a different CEO, and they were facing this world of, we make commodity computers that run someone else's operating system, which is Windows. And even though they were the leader, probably the leading Windows PC maker, at least in the US, it was still kind of a low margin business. It was getting lower. And so they said, well, the mobile world is shaping up to be the same thing, where they could build an Android phone, but it would become a commodity business and Google would make all the money. So they decided we need to have our own phone with our own operating system and be more like Apple. So they bought WebOS. And I think that was a great vision. Unfortunately, then the CEO was kicked out and they brought in a different guy who didn't really come from a consumer product background at all. He came, I think he wanted to turn HP into like IBM, big enterprise computing. And so he canceled WebOS and talked about canceling or selling off the PC division completely. Canceled WebOS and did it in a way that it couldn't be reversed. Not only did they fire the hardware team, but they shut down the supply chain. And when you build hardware, supply chain takes a year or two to crank up. So if you turn it off, you have to pay all this money to get out of contracts, and you can't easily build a new supply chain again. It takes, again, a couple years. So at that point, WebOS still existed, and it was interesting code, but without having shipping products, it was basically dead. And they sold it off to, I think they tried to spin it out for a while, and then I think it eventually was sold to LG, who uses it for smart TVs.
But this was a pity because I think it was like everybody's darling. So everybody's really
It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone loved it. But, sort of like what happened with when Oracle took over Sun.
Yeah.
There's still good ideas and there's still good people. And when there's a big change, those people then spread out into the industry and they take their ideas and contacts with them. And so, when Sun kind of imploded, and to be fair, Sun was going down long before Oracle bought them. Yeah. Lots of talented people went to other companies in the industry and have done great things. If you look at like the graphics and UI people on the Android team, at least half of them came from Sun. Mm-hmm. The same, a lot of great people went to Apple. When HP shut down WebOS, a lot of great people went to Nokia, went to Google, went to create mobile app startups. And all of those ideas and talent have worked their way into other products. So if you look at a modern Android or iOS device, there's a lot of WebOS still in there. Mm-hmm. A lot of apps built in web technology, more and more using card metaphors, the way they handle notifications with lots of gestures and swipes. that was all pioneered by WebOS, but is now diffused into the overall ecosystem. So even though it was bad for HP, and I feel very sad for the WebOS users, including myself, it was those ideas still percolated and are being used everywhere. So
now switch topics because I remember something. You built one time a widget system. I tried that, and you called that Awesome Box 2000 or something like this. You remember that?
Oh yeah, that was a fun side project I did when I was at Sun. When widgets were really taking off. And it turned out they were a flash in the pan. Eventually, all this stuff was going to move into apps on mobile phones.
Yeah.
But it was fun. I really wanted to push what we could do with Swing and JavaFX. And I still like the idea of having little apps that are very focused on one thing. And I think we might get there. Like, you sort of have that on Android with their dashboard widgets, though I don't know if they still support those. I haven't used Android regularly in a couple of years. But when we finally get AR headsets, like augmented reality headsets that are just built into your glasses, I think we'll have widgets again, where we have things that just sort of live in your periphery, and they pop up when needed to give you important information, and then they disappear again.
So the Awesome Box thing was like a small app installed in a kind of desktop, right?
Yeah, and it had this big pane that would it was like a sidebar, and then you click the button and this pane would slide out and it would show you all of your mini apps, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I just remember the name because it was interesting. Like,
yeah, I think it was, I remember now. The Wii had just been announced, and I said, if a kid was going to design their own game console, what would they name it? Like a 10-year-old would name it the Awesome Box 5000.
Yeah, something like this. And it's okay.
It was just it came out of some friends and I were just yakking one evening, and we came up with this name, and it just stuck.
Okay. Now we clarified this, so I know what it was, and I use it actually on my desktop machine, and I created a widget like a home automation widget. Because I hacked a heating control and used it to display things. So it was actually pretty useful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And but you also spent some time at Nokia, right?
I did. So I left Palm. They canceled everything, and I continued helping wind down our developer program and help our developers port their apps to other platforms. But my wife and I just had a baby, and I knew I couldn't travel like that with a young kid. So I moved to Nokia to do research for a couple years. And I got to play with Internet of Things stuff, a little bit of VR.
Finland? Was it in Finland?
I was in the not Mountain View, Sunnyvale office.
Sunnyvale, okay.
Yeah, I worked with a lot of people from Finland. Sadly, I never got a chance to go to the headquarters. Just never worked out timing-wise. But yeah, Nokia, again, there were a lot of great people there. And the point of our team was to research the future. And so if someone from a product team came and said, we want to build a smart toaster, what's it going to cost? Who do we get the components from? Our team could answer those sorts of questions. So a lot of research I did was on IoT and wearables, trying to figure out, is there money there? What kinds of products are people really going to want? And if we decide to build, say, a smartwatch, what components are we going to need? Who do we buy stuff from? So we prototyped a lot of things and wrote a lot of reports. Unfortunately, almost nothing that we did ever turned into a product. The closest I got was some work I did on Imagine, a point-and-shoot camera, but that had Android built into it. So you could have apps, but they were camera apps built into your camera, and so it felt like a traditional camera experience, but it could magically do additional things. And we got really close to... I did initial prototype work on that, on the UI and some of the Bluetooth LE things, and handed it off to another product team, and they I think they were a week away from announcing it when the Microsoft deal closed, and they ended up selling off that chunk of the company. to, I forget who bought that part. Part went to Microsoft, and then I think this got rolled up in the mapping division, and that was sold to some car makers. So it got lost in the shuffle and never shipped as a product.
Oh.
So after 3 years, and once my son was older, I was like, I want to build something that ships again. I'm tired of just doing research. So I left Nokia after another round of reorgs and joined a startup.
Okay. And they shipped something?
Yeah, they actually they were and still are a 100-person startup that does a service. Really, it's called PubNub. They produce what's they call it a real time. Basically, it's sort of like a CDN, but for real time data. So much like if you need your images and your video to be fast on the internet, you hire a CDN to host that for you. Well, they hosted the equivalent of WebSockets, so you could broadcast updates, you could implement chat systems, anything where you needed real-time communication. They were getting into IoT and do it at massive scale.
So something like MQTT, something like this, right?
Yeah, but if you wanted to do like one person pushes a button and then that message goes to 1 million people in real time, high scale stuff. I think they do. Now they're up to like 2 trillion messages a month, something insane.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I worked in their developer relations. I was head of DevRel there, and we worked on SDKs for a bunch of different platforms and just pushing the idea of the service. And then later they added blocks, which was like functions on demand. So you could write code that would live in the edge of the network and do things like one person types a message into the chat. Before the chat message makes it to the other user, it goes to this function which can then call out to like filter words or call to an IBM service to translate one language to another or other interesting things. Real-time filtering in the network. So that was fun, but life in startups is volatile. And the company ended up pivoting again to more enterprisey stuff, and our team was liquidated.
Okay.
So, but that's life in this career.
And finally, you are in Mozilla, right?
Yeah, Mozilla is another company I've always wanted to work for, and some of my colleagues from Nokia and from Sun ended up at Mozilla. So I joined. It was about a year ago.
After PubNub?
I joined after PubNub, yeah. I had some downtime where I just did contract work and played with my son for the summer. And then I joined Mozilla, I guess it was August of last year, so a year ago. Again, their developer relations team, but this time focusing on mixed reality, so virtual reality and augmented reality and stuff that's in between.
And this is how I find you again, because because I do lots of web standards right now. I do lots of backend Java stuff, and clients ask me now what you should do in the front end. And there are lots of crazy frameworks, and you don't need usually a lot of framework just to create a simple app. So so I started with web standards, and of course, if you do lots of web standards and web APIs, you will end up looking at MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, and the APIs, which are crucial, which are right now almost like a standard part of the. For me, it's almost like a JCP, JSR. So if I have a question, I go to MDN, I get the standard answer. And so very similar experience for me. Or this,
it's even more so. Originally, MDN stood for Mozilla Developer Network, but it has now become like Mozilla still provides a lot of the sponsorship, but it's kind of an independent thing. It's just called MDN, and Google and Microsoft contribute to it as well. So it really is the place for documenting web standards.
Exactly.
And if I can make it so that when you if you just type into Google the name of like a JavaScript function or an HTML element, usually MDN comes up first.
No,
sometimes
no.
Still W3C schools.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I want to get rid of W3C schools. It should be MDN.
I always searching like MDN and then whatever reduce array. So then I found it. So otherwise I get the W3 schools, whatever it is, with
Yeah, so we're making a very conscious effort. We're staffing up the MDN team, overhauling a lot of the pages, working on our Google ranking. So it's getting better.
Yeah.
And we just started. You'll notice on some pages there's programmatic information, like a table of, say, which browser supports this.
Yeah.
Or which version of the standard was introduced. We're starting to expose that data as an actual API so that it can be embedded into IDEs or other tools. Mm-hmm. So that's really exciting. The MDN team does great work.
Yeah, you can export the information in JSON format and do something with it. So it's actually interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And so then I look, in custom elements, web components, and then I subscribed to the Mozilla Developer Network, and then I found Josh Barinacci. It's like, oh, Josh? I know him from somewhere. And it's like, yeah, this is the Josh, swing son Josh. And then I've wanted to talk with you about, how you get there. But for me, what's interesting is I like JavaScript more and more, and for unknown reasons, the longer we wait, the more JavaScript becomes really like Java. So it is.
It does. It really is becoming more like Java. It's kind of funny.
And yeah, really funny. And for me, for instance, it's very easy to explain to Java developers JavaScript concepts using, the Java classes, like, for instance, service workers. Like if you try to explain, to someone who doesn't know Java, it is really hard. But for Java, it's like, look, it's like something like an executor service or a thread, and you can only communicate, with messages, and it has access to a hash map with request response called cache storage. And so, okay, that's easy, done.
Yep.
And what happens right now, what's interesting is, if I show Java developers the web standards thing, they really like it. They say, okay, this is a very similar to Swing back then. So we have now, grid layout, which was kind of, grid bag layout, a little bit easier, but similar. Okay. And you can, have similar architecture, and they like it. But before web standards, it was mission impossible. There were 50,000 frameworks. Every framework was completely different. It was just crazy.
Yeah, there was JavaScript. Because it didn't really have batteries included, the way, one of the geniuses of Java was not just the language itself, but it had the standard library. And this is still a problem with C++. Yeah. Like, if you say, how do I do a string in C++? So, say you're not a C++ developer, you come from somewhere else, and you're like, I just need a string. Well, there isn't really a standard. Because of the history of C++, there isn't a standard string class. There's many different ways of doing it. But in Java, from day one, it's like, this is how you do strings. Mm-hmm. And it meant that when they started improving like internationalization and Unicode support, the new things went into string. Mm-hmm. And everybody takes advantage. Having that one way of doing certain common things was huge. Mm-hmm. JavaScript does have a string class, but it didn't have a standard way of doing inheritance. Mm-hmm. It has the mechanism built in for predictable inheritance, but it didn't say like, okay, if this thing's going to inherit this thing, this is the way you should do it. So everybody had their own way of extending classes. Everybody had their own way of handling events, and it just kind of became a mess. And then a lot of the frameworks also had to deal with just browser differences. And so in the mid 2000s, nobody was going to write straight JavaScript. You always were writing jQuery. Yeah. Because jQuery handled all of the browser differences and gave you a nicer API. And these days you don't really need jQuery anymore.
Not at all.
It served its purpose for a good 10 years, but unless I'm building a big application where I need, panels and buttons and, I need an app framework, I just do straight JavaScript.
Yeah, we do straight JavaScript in big applications, because with, let's say, jQuery, so we have document query selector is almost as powerful as jQuery, like for DOM.
Oh yeah,
DOM searching.
And faster.
Yeah,
much faster.
Yeah, be careful with fast, because we get in lots of hints that we should use document get element by ID. It's the fastest.
Well, yeah, it does depend on what your queries are.
It is I tend to.
It's
one microsecond faster,
Right. What's funny is I end up recreating jQuery by just creating a function called $.
Yeah, yeah.
And all it does is call document query selector. But
Yeah.
it means my code can be, especially with arrow, now that we have arrow functions,
Yeah.
what we would call like anonymous inner classes or anonymous interface implementations in the Java world. We finally, JavaScript had this all along, but it didn't have the nice syntax. It's funny how Java and JavaScript have kind of each moved towards each other. Like modern Java with the Lambda work that Brian Getz has been doing feels as fluid and productive as JavaScript. And JavaScript is getting more of the rigorous types, and you kind of put it together yourself by adding linters and things, but it's getting more strongly typed the way that Java is. I think maybe just over time, all languages kind of, whatever their thing is and whatever they're missing, they fill in the things they were missing, and they kind of grow towards each other.
Yeah, and what's also fun is, I would say 5 years ago is just like JavaScript is a beautiful and lightweight functional language, and the truth is everyone wanted to have something like Java in JavaScript.
Yep.
And now we have it. And now if you take a look, for instance, at web component, it looks like, class something extends HTML element. And okay, the constructor is a bit different, but it really is like Java. It's the aesthetics are like Java. It's not. It was complete different experience to ES5, where you use lots of functions and I always call the IFEs and stuff like that. So now it's just modern Java or C# like syntax.
Yep. And we finally have modules working everywhere, which gives us something like Java packages.
Exactly. For Java developers, it's
years.
Just import and package and not OCI, right? So this is like exactly.
Yep.
And so what I'm also working a lot is our web components and custom elements, which are actually great. And you working on something else. You are AR, VR expert, right?
Yes.
So for the Java developers,
for that team.
What's the difference between AR and VR?
In the abstract, VR, virtual reality, is where you are completely immersed. There's a screen which covers your head, probably headphones that cover your ears. You're in a completely artificial world. Pure AR, augmented reality, is where you have a live view of the world, either through a camera or literally through glasses, where light's coming in, and then something digital is overlaid on top of the world, but is still interacting. So it's not just a heads-up display, but it's a heads-up display that's aware of what you're looking at and can, in the simplest, can say point in which direction is north because it's aware of the Earth's magnetic field. Or it does computer vision, and it could say do green screen effects where something you're looking at gets replaced with something else. In reality, those are the two platonic ideals. Reality is always some mixture of the two. So we call it mixed reality, and we think of it as just a spectrum. And where you are on the spectrum depends entirely on what you're doing, but you should be able to use the same tools, the same APIs to do those things.
Okay, so we have so there's just AR, VR, MR, and nothing else, right? So there are the.
Well, what we've coined is XR for lack of anything else. We still call it mixed reality, but XR is this new spec. WebXR is a spec which will encompass VR and AR and provide all the browser hooks so that when you write code, it will work in VR, it'll work in AR, it'll work in any brand of headset, and it will still respect user privacy. So, people love the idea of AR in a browser, and then we're like, wait, we're going to give webcam access not only to your face, but to everything around you to some random web page? That might be dangerous. So privacy and security is a big part of this.
And XR is going to be the spec, right?
Yes. So today we have WebVR, which essentially exposes VR headsets, and then the controllers are exposed just like game controllers would be. And that's supported in a couple of browsers, including ours. long term is WebXR, which supersedes VR, adds the AR components, and focuses on security and being a true web standard. We were initially a working group. Now we have an actual W3C sanctioned draft, and it's going through the whole standards process. The good news is there are people from Mozilla, Google, Microsoft, Apple, like every browser maker is involved in this, and so it will eventually be everywhere. So it's really exciting to be at the beginning of a new technology, even though it's not really new, but it's new this time, and to be able to shape it. The web is there from day one. Security and privacy we're thinking about from day one. So it's a lot of fun. Every couple months, like there's new hardware out, there's new incredible ideas that developers come up with. It's exciting.
And you remember VRML?
I do, and some of the people who created that are still around working on those modern versions of it. We now have something called GLTF. Mm-hmm. VRML was definitely a better name for it, but it's essentially a transmission format for 3D graphics, which has now become a standard and is being used everywhere. So no matter what game engine you're using, it can read GLTFs. No matter what 3D modeler you're using, it can produce GLTFs. It's like the JPEG for 3D.
But Apple released something similar, right?
They did, and that's a case where Apple went out on their own, but we also haven't seen much adoption for it.
Okay.
So I'm hoping that they will come around and support GLTF as well.
Okay, what's the standard from Apple? What's the no standard? What's the technology from Apple?
I'm trying to remember. It was basically a 3D modeling,
which is zipped
API from Pixar, like one of Pixar's 3D tools, which is then zipped up. The problem is it's really a format that's meant for editing, not a format that's meant for publishing.
Okay.
Much like you can think of it as like in the 2D world, you don't edit your JPEGs. You're editing either raw files from your camera or your Photoshop format files in Photoshop. You do all your editing work, and then what you produce at the end is your final JPEG. Mm-hmm. Well, GLTF is the final output that you're using for production. Mm-hmm. What they chose to use is really an editing format, not a publishing format.
Okay.
I don't know why, Apple's quiet about those things, but I hope that they will come around and work with us on GLTF.
Mm-hmm. Different question regarding the Mozilla browser. Probably you know the answer. So it was completely rewritten, I would say, a few months ago, right? And so now the Mozilla browser is a really fast engine inside. But my impression is the Mozilla is lagging a bit behind the standards. And the reason for that, I think, was the refactoring project, right? So now you are catching up with all the standards. Is it the right impression?
No. So we didn't rewrite the browser from scratch. What we've been doing
engine. Yeah.
is even the engine, we haven't been rewriting from scratch. We've been replacing parts of it one at a time while still keeping it running. We had this other research project called Servo, which the idea was if we use a safe language like Rust and built a browser from scratch for the new world of you have GPUs everywhere and lots of memory, how would we do it? And Servo is truly we're building a brand new browser from scratch, but it was an experiment. And what we've done is some of those experiments turned out to be really good, and we're taking pieces of Servo one by one, pulling them into Firefox, but still keeping, it's still Gecko. It's just like we took out the CSS selector engine and brought in a new one. We took out the CSS styling engine and brought in a new one at a time. In terms of web standards, it's always a race between the browser vendors. Sometimes, for a while Google will be ahead, for a while we'll be ahead, and they'll be ahead in one area, we'll be ahead in another. Right now, we're definitely ahead in supporting the VR technologies, and we were ahead in. I'm trying to remember what was the other one I was thinking of recently. I forget, but for the most part, the browser makers are actually working together very well, and so you'll see something like CSS Grid. CSS Grid went from one experimental version to basically all browsers supporting it fully in about a year. And compared to the past, that is light speed.
Yeah, of course. This was like
and
incredible. Yeah.
it's fantastic. Like Flexbox took 3 or 4 years to reach that same level of standardization and deployment that Grid did. So I think in general, it's getting better where you don't need to worry. You don't care about which browser you're using based on its standard support. You're going to care which browser you're using based on its features or how it works with privacy or the user experience. The standards are standards. It should be this boring thing that no one has to care about. And I think we're getting to that world.
Yeah, perfect. So now back to VR, where Mozilla is leading. So, so I'm a Java developer, JavaScript developer. Can I try it right now, some VR, and how to do that?
Yes. So if you have a VR headset attached to your desktop or laptop computer, then you can install the current version of Firefox, and it will work. If you go to a web page that has some VR content, there'll be a button that says Enter VR. Push the buttons, put on your headset, and it works. What I think is more interesting
are supported right now, like Oculus Go or
Oculus Go, HTC Vive, the Windows mixed reality headsets. There's like 3 or 4 of those. In general, Apple doesn't have as good support on the Mac. So I think only the HTC Vive, maybe the Vive Pro.
But the Oculus Go is independent from the desktop. So I mean,
right. So I'm talking about tethered headsets. Okay. Now, when we go to standalone, the situation is very different. And we just released Firefox Reality, which is a browser designed from the ground up for VR. Meaning it's not a 2D browser that lets you then view VR, go into VR mode. It's a browser you use while you are in VR, which also supports immersive content. We started with the Android version of Firefox and then completely rewrote the UI, did a lot of work on the graphics stack. And so now if you have an Oculus Go, which is a standalone, essentially it's the guts of like a 1 or 2 year old high-end smartphone. With all the optics and everything. So it's a VR headset. You don't have to, other than charging, you don't have to plug it into a laptop. It works entirely on its own. It has its own app store. And now it has its own version of Firefox. And so you can browse the 2D web within VR, and you can view 3D movies. You can play 3D games, immersive VR games, right from within Firefox Reality.
So what you're saying is that there is in the store of Oculus a version of Firefox VR?
Yep. The Oculus Go store, we should clarify, because there's also the Oculus store for PC, which is for the Oculus Rift.
Okay.
Their naming can be confusing sometimes. The same with Google. So they have Google Daydream refers both to their standalone Daydream headset, and we have a version of Firefox Reality in that store, as well as their the ones where you take your phone and you stick it in the viewer. And technically, our code should run on that kind as well, but we don't officially support it.
So then I can use in VR, I will find Firefox on the wall and just go to Firefox. I can browse 2D web, right?
Yep, you can load up Facebook, you can read the New York Times, and you can also go to a page that has VR content, press the Enter VR button, and now you have this immersive experience. Now, because it's so difficult to find VR content, because it's still very early, the startup page in Firefox Reality actually is a curated selection of stuff that we have found on the web, good VR experiences for the web. So, and we're constantly updating that. At least we're trying to get to a cadence of about once a week. We're going to have some new things up there. So it's, and if you are listening to this, you're a web VR developer or just a web developer thinking of doing VR, let me know. We have a page where you can submit your content. We can work with you to help improve it, do performance tuning, improve the experience. We want people to make great VR stuff on the web.
Yeah, but we are almost in metaverse, Now we are.
We are pretty close. We have this thing called Hubs, which sort of started as an experiment, and now it's becoming very popular. It's VR chat. You create a chat room. It's a VR world. You send a link to your friends, and they can join that same room, and you can talk to each other with your voice. You have little cute robot avatars, and you can now paste in like YouTube links or animated GIFs or PDFs, and you can all view or interact with that media together. And you don't have to install anything. It's just the web.
And the Hubs is an app inside Mozilla VR running. Firefox VR running in Oculus, right?
It can run inside Oculus, but you can go to it from any web browser.
Okay.
Like you can be on your desktop running IE. Well, I don't know if we support IE, but Safari or Edge or Chrome, or of course Firefox. Go to this link, and you now have a 3D view on your 2D screen. You could then send that link to somebody on a phone, and they will and we support touch events, and you can still interact and talk. It's just not immersive, but you can still move around through the environment. And then you can send that link to somebody who has an Oculus Go. They bring that link up on the go, either through Oculus's own browser or through ours, and you're dropped into the environment. One of the key parts of the web is that you can build an experience which is responsive to any device, any screen size, any browser, any form factor. So you can be in 2D or 3D and still interact with all of your friends. That's really the vision of Hubs. Mm-hmm. And you don't have, it's not even an app. You just go to hubs.mozilla.com and create a room, and you now have a link that you can share with everybody. And, be social, have fun. Send silly gifts to your friends.
No, it can be useful. So I'm thinking about, I'm right after Airhacks TV. This is like monthly question and answer show where I do live streaming. So it could be an idea to create a hub for it and see what happens,
Oh yeah, that would be fun. We use it for our weekly stand-up meetings where we just, we're telling everybody on the team, because a lot of our team is actually remote. Probably less than half of Mozilla is in California. The rest, we are either regional offices or work from home around the world. Mm-hmm. So having a VR, conference room essentially is really valuable. So we definitely dog food this. We use it every week.
So it really remembers me the Wonderland project.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that. I wanted Sun to continue that. I guess it just didn't make sense for the kind of market Sun was in, but there were some great ideas there.
Mm-hmm. Project Wonderland and Darkstar,
Oh yeah.
This was a gaming engine.
Yep.
That's okay. So now we learned how to use that, but as a developer, how I can create content, or can I program that, or what's the idea? So let's say I have what I should do, or
so underneath. There's an API called WebVR, which lets you enter and exit WebVR, get info on the headset. You can use the gamepad APIs to get the controllers. And the drawing is done with WebGL. And WebGL is literally bindings to OpenGL on the web. So it's the same. You're essentially using the same APIs you would from C or on an iPhone with OpenGL ES or desktop. Now, if you've done any 3D graphics programming, OpenGL is very low level. You're essentially doing a bunch of memory management. Unless you're building a game engine, you probably don't want to work at that level. Mm-hmm. What I recommend people do is either start with 3JS, which is a very popular open source library for 3D. It gives you a scene graph. So you can say, here's my scene. I'm going to add a cube here. I'm going to put a light here. I'm going to add a sphere here and make it rotate. It's a scene graph very similar to the tree structure in a swing scene or Java effects. Mm-hmm. And then from there you can start customizing with different geometry, different materials. If you're completely new to 3D and you're not familiar with scenes, then I suggest you start with A-Frame. A-Frame is built on top of 3JS, and it essentially gives you an HTML-like syntax. So you can literally just say a scene, and then inside that element you put a box and give it some properties for its size, and a cube. And it handles everything about entering VR, handling cross-browser differences, the polyfills for devices that don't have VR support yet, and it just works. So you can, in 60 seconds, have a simple 3D scene that you can enter VR, and it works. Mm-hmm. So I suggest people start with A-Frame, and then you'll move to 3JS, And then if you outgrow Three.js, then that's when you start looking at either 3D game engines like Unity or Unreal, and they support WebVR exports. Or Amazon has a new product called Sumerian, which has a nice web-based editor, and you can bring in your 3D assets, add your sounds, write code, and publish to the web.
Actually, a WebAssembly could also play a role, right?
Yeah, so more and more of these are using WebAssembly, which, if you haven't heard of WebAssembly before, it's essentially an assembly language that works on the web. So it's not specific to any processor, but it is much faster than JavaScript could ever be. There are certain things JavaScript, the language, does, like dynamic allocation and bounds checking, and things just inherent to the language that will always be a little slower. The things that just can't be optimized away. WebAssembly is basically the output of a compiler, and it's just that it's, instead of being for a particular computer chip, it's for browsers. And so you can compile C code, C++ code, Rust code, and a lot of people have started doing that, where they took their existing C++ game engine that they've tweaked and made really fast over a decade, compile that to WebAssembly, and you now have this essentially blob of code which can run really fast, and then you can write JavaScript which talks to it. And that's another, it's another case where it was a standard that had been in research for years, and then in a period of about 1 year, it basically became supported everywhere. And so for things like 3D graphics, for machine learning in the browser, for computer vision in the browser, all of that stuff becomes many times faster thanks to WebAssembly.
Actually, it was one of the Mozilla projects, right? It was this ASM, I think, right?
Yeah, it started as ASM. It actually started out of one of the game groups. We're like, what could we do to make games run faster? And it turned out to be really useful for all sorts of things.
But what's funny is, so what browser becomes over time is like another JVM, not JVM, a VM, right? So
yeah, it's really the virtual machine for the whole world now.
Exactly, because
not controlled by one company.
Yeah, because now the VR what we're talking about is no more about markup. It's like getting a low-level access to the hardware, right?
Yep.
Cool. What are the killer use cases? So I think it's hard to find some for VR, but there are lots for AR, right?
It's still really early days. It's like saying, what was the killer app for the iPhone when it first launched? Like the first apps were, people created little lightsabers or soundboards. There were a lot of novelty apps. And it took a while before we found things like Instagram or Instapaper or Snapchat, where we started figuring out what mobile was really good at. It's going to be the same for VR. There are a lot of early experiments. People are trying 360 videos, generally like 5 to 10 minutes. People are trying games, were the obvious first start. Where I think long-term, the potential is in things like training. Walmart just bought 20,000 Oculus Go's that they're going to use to train their employees, so they could simulate, like, this is what you're going to do if there's a snowstorm, or there's a terrorist attack, or it's Black Friday and you have people lined up out the door. There's going to be use it in schools, experience like walking on Mars or dinosaurs, things you couldn't do in real life. There's going to be uses in medical applications. I mean, it's going to eventually be like, what do you use a smartphone for? Well, these days, everything. But it took us 10 to 15 years to get to that point. I think it's going to be the same with VR. We just don't know what the killer app is yet. And our goal is to help the world find that by lowering the barrier to friction, let people create stuff easily, share it easily, iterate easily.
Exactly what I think the game changer is going to be, the hardware. If the AR will feel like just sunglasses and not like, a huge device on your head, Then you could
AR
create
is a couple years, but
Yeah.
AR is still a couple years out. Like the HoloLens was 4,000 a couple years ago. The Magic Leap just came out. It's 2,000. It still feels like a developer product, something for people to use to prototype. It's amazing at that, but it's not ready for mass market. For VR, the Oculus Go is $200. It's completely standalone. Like you buy it, you put it on your head, you're in VR. I think the Go is like the tipping point for VR to go into mainstream. And we're probably a couple years out for the AR equivalent, but it's coming. It will come.
But if you imagine, if you get, just sunglasses like experience, so very thin and just, subtle, and then we're able to, for instance, to inject information on the glasses or direct to the iris, then we have our killer use case, because that is really useful if you walk around and you see additional information, if you like. So
yeah, it's coming. We may be 5 years before we get the consumer version, but it's going to happen. And it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
So perfect. So now, Josh, where people can find you? Do you have any references?
So right now I'm on Twitter at Josh Marinacci. The easiest email to type is josh@josh.earth. It still all redirects to the same thing. And I started a Twitch stream. I try to at least once a week. I talk about the latest VR news and then do some coding. In fact, tomorrow on my Twitch channel, I'm going to show how to build a lightsaber in VR.
Cool.
So that will be fun. So those are the 3 places people should get a hold of me.
Okay. So thank you a lot, and let's see what happens in 5 years. So I would like to invite you then with our glasses, and we'll meet in the hub.
Yep. Yeah, in 5 years, we're basically going to have like Iron Man suits.
Yeah, exactly. So this would be fun. Okay, then see you then with Iron Man suit, right?
Absolutely. Thanks.
Bye.